Welcome everybody to what has been billed as the penultimate meeting of the 2016-2017 Mellon Sawyer Seminar. It's my great pleasure to introduce Lynn Ransom, who is project manager for the Schoenberg database of manuscripts and is also a founding member of the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Ransom holds a BA in art history from the University of the South and an MA and PhD in medieval art history from the University of Texas at Austin, with an emphasis on manuscript illumination. Before coming to the Schoenberg Institute, Dr. Ransom held positions in the manuscript collections at the Free Library of Philadelphia and the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. She also served as a researcher at the Index of Christian Art at Princeton University. Her current research interests involve the provenance of medieval manuscripts and the history of international manuscript cataloging efforts in the early 20th century. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker.
So thank you. I first want to just say thanks to everyone, to Melissa, Paul, and Catherine, and Tim for inviting me to come to be part of this very distinguished lecture series, and also just to say thank you to the Mellon Foundation for making this possible. I'm going to be conscious of time. I'm compressing two projects here in this paper, so I'm just going to jump right in and get started. If I say anything that doesn't make any sense, just feel free to raise your hand and ask a question, because some of it is going to be a little bit technical. In the spring of 2014, the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies received a grant from the NEH to redevelop the Schoenberg database of manuscripts into an online, community-driven, user-maintained tool and resource for researching the historic and current locations of the world's manuscript books produced before the age of print. We proposed in essence that it would become a finding aid on a global scale. What's more, this tool would allow anyone with an internet connection to contribute and help us refine our data regarding both the current and historic locations of these books, while in the process of conducting their own research. We committed, therefore, to crowdsourcing the management of this large, unique, homegrown, and sometimes problematic data set. If this worked, our users would in effect become our new data source and management system as a result of simply using the database for their own research. While this project may have seemed both innovative and ambitious to the grant reviewers, it's not the first time such a reckoning of the world's manuscripts has been attempted. In fact, almost 100 years ago, before the age of computers, digital databases, and the internet, an American librarian and medieval scholar by the name of Ernest Cushing Richardson set out to do something quite similar. In his terms, to create a union catalog of the world's manuscripts. While union catalogs for manuscripts had been produced on regional and national scales since as early as the first libraries, and a union catalog, the definition of a union catalog is simply the merging of two or more collections together. No one had ever attempted a union catalog on this global scale before. Today I'd like to bring to light Richardson's project. I doubt many of you have heard of it, very few have, unless you happen to get on my academia.edu page and see the article published in a very obscure publication. And then I'd like to compare it to what we're doing with the Schoenberg database. There are enough similarities in scope, ambition, and execution that it's worth thinking about what the implications of the comparison are, not only for the database project, but also for the way in which we approach problems in crowdsourcing manuscript cataloging and description today. Before getting to the specifics of the project, allow me first to take some time to introduce you to Richardson, a figure whom I would wager is not known to many, if any, in this room. He spent most of his career as the librarian of Princeton University from 1890 to 1925, then became the honorary consultant in bibliography at the Library of Congress, where he successfully oversaw the coordination and expansion of the National Union Catalog Project at the Library of Congress from 1927 to 1934. By all contemporary accounts, he was well regarded by his peers and was considered in his own time to be one of the architects of modern library science in the US. Here he is at the 1904 meeting of the American Library Association in St. Louis, at which he had just been made president with his colleagues, whose names you may know, Reuben Goldthwait and Herbert Putnam. Herbert Putnam was the Librarian of Congress at the time. Through his involvement in the ALA, as well as the American Library Institute, which was a think tank for the developing field of library and information science, which existed from 1904 to 1941, Richardson shaped infrastructure and policies whose impact can still be felt today in the library world. He was noted especially in regard to the ALA's work on international intellectual cooperation, and for over 30 years directed the ALA's efforts toward this end through the successively named Committees on International Cooperation, which he chaired from 1900 to 1905, which then became the Committee on International Relations between 1905, which he chaired 1905, 1910, and then later, when it became the Committee on Bibliography in 1922, he continued as the chair. And so the changes in the name are just sort of indicative of how the library science world was sort of trying to find its identity. And it's interesting that it ended up being called the Committee on Bibliography, which was equated with intellectual cooperation. As a librarian, Richardson was a man of great vision and an impressive work ethic. But he came to his career somewhat by accident. Following graduation from Amherst College in 1880, he went to Hartford Theological Seminary in Connecticut to pursue a master's in medieval theology. Thanks to his previous experience working in the library at Amherst College to pay his way through school, he was hired in his first year as the assistant to the seminary librarian and professor of ecclesiastical history, Chester David Hartranft, with whom he would develop a close working relationship during his time at the seminary. For his studies, Richardson focused on the relatively new field of textual criticism under the mentorship of the New Testament scholar Matthew Brown Riddle. Since 1871, Riddle had been a member of the group of British and U.S. scholars working on the revision of the King James Bible. And based on this experience, he came to understand and impressed upon his students the value of manuscript books as primary source materials for textual criticism, especially in regard to scripture and theological text. He also imparted the difficulty and frustration that American scholars especially faced in finding the manuscript resources they needed to do their work, whether in American or European libraries. At the time, librarianship was a fairly local enterprise, and the ability for libraries to systematically make their resources available to researchers through standardized cataloging practices was only beginning to evolve. So, the World Cat and the card catalog and those things that we take for granted today had not been put into place. So going to libraries and finding what was there was really difficult. For Riddle and other revisers of the Bible, the task of tracking down manuscripts, especially manuscripts as compared to printed books, was therefore especially laborious and expensive. This frustration was also shared by Riddle's colleague at the seminary, Chester Hartranft, who, as I just mentioned, was Richardson's mentor in the library. Hartranft was at the forefront of the developing field of library science, specifically for the purpose of addressing the problems of cooperative research as exemplified in the Revision Project. As a founding member of the ALA in 1876, he worked closely with the likes of Melville Dewey and Charles Amy Cutter to develop the type of cooperative cataloging practices and new technologies that libraries could employ towards enabling broader accessibility and sharing of information across boundaries and borders. As Richardson would recall later in his life, Hartwell's influence was significant and propelled the young seminarian toward a career in librarianship rather than scholarship, though he never fully gave up his studies and actually integrated them into his work at Princeton. It must have been an exciting time to be working in libraries. Led by such figures as Dewey and Cutter in the States, the theoretical and technological advancements in the field of library science, ranging from the development of ontological classification systems based on numeric values that aim to standardize the location of books within and across libraries, the development of the cross-reference card catalog with its standardized 3x5 index card, to advances in telecommunications and new techniques in printing and photo reproduction. These opened up a myriad of new possibilities for gathering, sharing, retrieving, and storing and disseminating information. Indeed, it must have felt something like the 1990s when the internet opened up for this young librarian, and who completely embraced these new methods and technologies for the promise that they held in streamlining research. When Hartranft stepped down from his position as librarian in 1884 to return to teaching, he appointed Richardson as his successor and set down the principles of librarianship as he saw them and charged Richardson with executing them. First, a librarian must perfect himself in accomplishments of textbooks of library science, which means he needed to write textbooks for library science because there were none, which Richardson did. He wrote a history of classification systems going back to Alexandria that became a seminal textbook in library and information schools in the first part of the century. Second, he must be active in library association work. Third, he must visit and study libraries at home and abroad to learn from and share practices. Fourth, he must teach in the field of bibliology. And finally, he must do original manuscript research to keep in sympathy and in touch with professors and seminary instructors. Richardson considered these principles as the foundation of his own theory of librarianship that he took with him when he left the Hartford Seminary and went to Princeton in 1890 to become the librarian there. Richardson's subsequent career and achievements at Princeton were notable. In addition to transforming the local library into a world-class research institution, he continued his scholarly work translating patristic writings and edited critical texts of Gennadius of Massilia and St. Jerome, and published on the life of Jacopo da Voragine. He also managed to spend months abroad every year pursuing his research and hunting manuscripts, as he liked to say. And this was actually built into his contract. I don't know if he had an actual paper contract, but it was one of the conditions of being hired, is that he would have this time. When he left Princeton in 1925 to become the honorary consultant in bibliography at the Library of Congress, his record of accomplishments were considerable. Thus far, Richardson's biography raises 2 points that are helpful in understanding the Union World Catalog of Manuscripts project. First, that it was developed in response to problems facing scholars working in the new field of textual criticism as taught to him by Matthew Riddle. And second, that it got as far as it did because of a curious combination of ambitious vision and dogged pragmatism that drove both his professional and scholarly work. Both of these points would define and explain his approach and methodology. Reflecting on the origins of the manuscript project in the summary of method, which I think I distributed through a link for everyone to read, that he wrote at the end of the project, Richardson credited Hartranft's principles with providing the efficient cause, as he put it, of the Union World Catalog of Manuscript Books, and it became a priority of his that lasted throughout his career. Speaking to colleagues at a meeting in 1909 at the Bibliographical Society of America, Richardson first publicly laid out his ideas to create what he then called a finding list of the world's manuscript books. His resource would enable any researcher, in Richardson's view, to locate from his desk all copies of a text that needed to be consulted before any conclusions about that text could be made. And I did want to remind you that I said he is ambitious. Of his finding list, he believed, and he stated, it would be a great but by no means superlative task to make a complete finding list of all extant manuscripts in volume 4 form up to the year 1500, at least in European languages. And it will most likely be done before many years have passed. If done, it may be expected from our experience that thousands of lost works will be automatically discovered or rediscovered, centuries of the time of historical scholars and textual critics saved, myriads of historical mistakes spared, other myriads of futile books prevented, and in general, a final saving made to human civilization of thousands of times the cost of this work. It would take almost another 20 years for Richardson to actually get started on the project. which only happened when he attached it to the much larger project of the American Library Association to create the National Union Catalog of Printed Books. In 1926, Richardson, as chair of the Committee on Bibliography, presented a plan to the Executive Council of the ALA to move forward with a National Union Catalog and to systematically strengthen the bibliographic apparatus of the ALA. Attached to this plan were several corollary projects. One, a supplementary catalog of printed books in foreign libraries. Two, a union catalog of special collections in American libraries. Three, a supplemental catalog of, a union catalog of special collections in American libraries. And then the third part was the supplemental catalog of special collections in foreign libraries. And four, a union, a union catalog of world manuscripts. The proposal won unanimous approval from the council, and it was determined that the National Union Catalog project would be moved to the Library of Congress and directed by Richardson, who by that time had been appointed to the honorary consultant position. It was given the name Project B and ran complementary to but independently from two other projects that also supported the strengthening of the bibliographic apparatus of the ALA. Project A was an acquisition of facsimiles for historical research, so facsimiles of manuscript books. And Project C, which we are all now familiar with, is the Ricci census of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts in the United States and Canada. Project B was provided funding for 5 years in the amount of $50,000 from John D. Rockefeller. Within that time, Richardson put into effect his belief in the power of intellectual cooperation and marshaled the collaborative, coordinated efforts of librarians around the country to contribute brief, formulaic bibliographic entries following a method Richardson devised and called short title cataloging. These titles were recorded on 3x5 cards and sent as copies to Washington, and then collated into the National Card Catalog. Thanks to this early form of crowdsourcing, by 1932, Project B had located 9 million copies of more than 7 million separate print titles in U.S. libraries. His experience, therefore, showed Richardson that large-scale collaboration could produce significant results. So it was utterly conceivable to him that a union catalog of the world's manuscripts, which unlike printed books were finite in number, could easily be accomplished based on a similar level of collaboration, though this time on an international scale. And even though he had failed to secure further funding after 1932 from the ALA, he made impressive progress toward demonstrating and proving his method. He published the results of his methodological demonstration in 6 volumes under the title, A Union World Catalog of Manuscript Books, Preliminary and Studies in Method, between 1933 and 1937. And you're seeing the title page showing all the volumes. That's in the summary of method. In these volumes, he laid out his method and provided 2 demonstration experiments. After working through these, I'm convinced that had he been given more funding and support, the project as laid out in these volumes could have eventually been successful. Each of the volumes, which are listed here, marks a different step in his proposed method. The first step, a rough survey of the world's collections of manuscript books that was based on titles of collection catalogs that he had gathered in the National Union Catalog file. 2, a demonstration of the method using book collections of Spain and Portugal that was carried out by his Princeton colleague, Henry Grubbs, in Spain. 3, a list of existing printed catalogs of manuscripts, so these were his sources. 4, a further demonstration of the method with what he called Oriental manuscripts, but were the Arabic collections at Princeton. And then 5th, a supplement to the manuscript book collections of Spain and Portugal, because once they went to Spain and Portugal, they realized that there were that many more manuscripts to be discovered that weren't in catalogs. And then finally, a summary of method. Reflecting on the project in its final volume, The Summary of Method, Richardson described the Union World Catalog of Manuscripts as little more than a card catalog, which could be added to and rearranged over time. At the outset of the project, entries would be made from published catalogs available to him at the Library of Congress. Eventually, he hoped that scholars working in the field, as it were, like grubs in libraries in the US and around the world, would contribute entries on manuscripts from these unpublished collections, again relying on the type of crowdsourcing that made the National Union Catalog a success. Employing the short title catalog method that he had used for the National Union Catalog, Richardson insisted that the entry on each manuscript be limited to one line and contain only the most basic information to enable scholars to identify copies of particular text. This was to include author, title, location, shelf mark or other identifying number, dimensions, folio count, and date if time and space permitted. Entries were to be typed on, as he measured it in metrics, 7.5 by 12.5 centimeters or 3 by 5 index cards, placed at the top of each card in one line. The entry would be placed at the top of each card in one line to facilitate convenient overlapping and photostatic copying. Authors' names were to be given in full, but other details were to be abbreviated to the highest possible degree. These guidelines were established so that entries would fit on one 29M linotype bar, which with compressed 6-point type would permit 100 to 120 characters per line if the card catalog were to make it to print, which he actually never felt was a necessary outcome. A slug would be created for each entry and kept in a relevant envelope. Envelopes would be sorted alphabetically and updated as necessary. A typical entry in a printed version of the Union World Catalog, exemplified in Volume 2, would thus look something like this. Thomas Aquinas, a copy of his Questiones Quodlibitalis that's in Tortosa, Spain, in the Capitulari Library in Tortosa, and that it, I'm sort of reading along here, that it comes from a catalog from Denis, it's number 1 in that catalog, that it's Latin, that it's produced in the 13th century on parchment and in quarto. To give you a sense of scale, here's the page on which this entry appears in the in his volumes in Volume 2. It's tiny, it's very hard to read. This level of attention to detail exemplifies Richardson's approach to the project. The strict formulation and discipline that Richardson applied to his method of manuscript description may seem a bit much, but it's why I think his project would have succeeded in a different time using the technologies or it would have succeeded, using a different set of technologies like we have now. What was available to him at the time were standardized cards, the linotype, photostatic copying, and et cetera. But had he had the internet, things might have been different. By the time he wrote his summary of method, he understood exactly what had to be done and what he could not do in order to achieve success. The demonstration experiment as described in these volumes proved his method had to be quick, economical to produce, easy to reproduce, and easy to expand. He describes in great detail the method, which if done effectively would cost only 10 cents per title to produce, or as to produce as a card catalog, or 30 cents to produce if the catalog were to be printed. In comparison, he spends quite a bit of time in the summary of method breaking down the cost of other cataloging experience. So Dorici, his titles, which were sort of a compromise between the short title catalog method and long title catalog, full descriptions, would cost 5 to 10. Ferris's description of the Arabic manuscripts at Princeton, if they had been done the way Ferris wanted them to be done, would have been something like $30 per title. He also understood that what he could not do was create a finding list that was free from error. But in his mind, an error-filled entry on a manuscript was better than not having an entry at all. He accepted that most of the entries would come from catalog descriptions rather than from direct observation, and that these in themselves were far from error-proof. So he made provisions in his plan to faithfully document where the description was obtained. He also insisted that sources not be corrected in order to maintain fidelity to the catalog and possibly to fidelity to the manuscript itself. So there might be a title written in a manuscript might be misspelled or spelled with another variation, and he wanted to preserve that. as good evidence. And he accepted that his union catalog would never be complete and published in the manner of traditional print catalogs. Instead, the final outcome would be the card catalog in which cards could be added, removed, relocated at any time. It was expandable. But unfortunately, the logistics of getting a global project on the scale off the ground proved to be an insurmountable challenge. By 1935, he lost the backing of the ALA and was left to publish the last 3 volumes of the demonstration of method out of his own pocket, which he did in 1937. At which point, he abandoned the project and retired from his position at the Library of Congress, and then he passed away in 1939, and his vision of a Union World Catalog of manuscripts was soon forgotten. The downfall of this project could be attributed to several reasons. In the first place, he couldn't secure the funding for it. Secondly, and completely missing the point, scholars and catalogers criticized his demonstration method because there were too many inaccuracies and errors in the resulting short title entries, and not enough description. Larger societal issues, economic depression, political instability, this is in the interwar period, also likely contributed to its demise. Ultimately, though, I think Richardson was unsuccessful because his method relied too much on human input, which is inherently unreliable, inconsistent, and prone to making errors in judgment, and people didn't trust it. Also, his Union World Catalog of manuscripts didn't serve a population big enough to justify the time, effort, and expense it would have taken to build it. What Richardson needed was a computer and a network system of information retrieval and input. What he needed was the Schoenberg database of manuscripts, the new Schoenberg database of manuscripts. Yay! We just actually launched this version of it a couple of weeks ago, April 1st, actually. Since we began redevelopment in June 2014, we've created all the functionality promised in our grant proposal to make crowdsourcing data management possible, and have opened it to our online community. It's a powerful tool that, in addition to the ability to search a growing body of over 225,000 records, representing about 90,000 manuscripts, it allows any user who signs up to join the user community to contribute data, comment on others' contributions, communicate with users through a public forum or a private messaging app, contribute to a VIAF-based name authority for people and institutions involved in the making and collecting of manuscripts, create and join user groups for the purposes of collaboration, bookmark and watch activity on any record, and download your search results under a Creative Commons license to use as you wish. Building this tool from a purely technical point of view hasn't been hard. The challenge, however, as with Richardson's project, has been to ensure that the data itself maintains a high enough level of integrity so that our user community can continue to have faith in it and continue using it. With crowdsourcing in the internet age, it's one thing to throw open the barn doors, but what happens to the farm when you let the world in to run it? Over the course of the redevelopment, with every decision, we've had to consider the risks involved in enabling crowdsourcing and then make the best decisions possible in the face of a number of often unexpected human and technical limitations. How do we maintain good data entry standards for manuscript description that will continue to make discovery and access possible without confusing or intimidating the non-specialist who may have access to manuscript data that scholars do not? Can we accept a certain level of bad data, which is inevitable in this operational context? How do you manage user expectations when your data isn't perfect? Is crowdsourcing worth the risks that it introduces? And how much can you manage unseen users' interactions with data entry and management process before they get annoyed with the interface and go away? Our responses to these considerations fundamentally shape the design and implementation of the new database in sometimes surprising but mostly useful ways. Like Richardson, we had to make hard decisions about what our data, our entries were, and what they were not. We had to accept that our data wasn't going to be perfect and that our crowd was going to be unskilled in data entry practices, no matter what their knowledge of manuscript culture was. and would need a certain amount of guidance to ensure a barrier-free experience. In return, our users will have to accept that their ideas of good manuscript description will have to conform to our minimal standards for the greater good of the project. But first, I should give you some background on the Schoenberg database for those of you who may not be familiar with it. Its history has defined how we've had to approach the development. The database has always been an incomparable resource for the study of the provenance of manuscript books produced before 1600. And it was produced in 1997, so it's been in existence for quite a long time. Since it first went online in 2005, the database has been the largest repository of descriptive data on medieval and early modern manuscripts that's freely available online. The version you see here has been the access point for users since 2009. Through this site, one could search data drawn from over 12,000 auction and sale catalogs, inventories, catalogs from institutional and private collections, and other sources documenting transfers and locations of manuscript books since as early as the 15th century. Indeed, it served these many years a wide range of users, an international body of scholars, book collectors and booksellers, students at various levels, and citizen scholars interested in the movement of manuscript books across time and geography. As I said, the database began life in 1997 as a simple spreadsheet that its creator, the American manuscript collector Lawrence J. Schoenberg, used to track the history of values and locations of manuscripts that passed through the market. But ultimately, Larry's interest turned into a broader fascination with the spreadsheet's ability to track specific manuscripts as they went from one owner to the next, from one sale to the next. The spreadsheet, which was eventually converted into a flat file Microsoft Access database to handle its growth, recorded brief information. And you have to remember when you're looking at the data of the database, especially the older records, that there used to be character limits not so long ago on things like Access databases. So we have a lot of abbreviation. So the database recorded transaction details that included the catalog date, the name of the seller, the buyer if it were known, catalog title or ID number, and lot number, as well as details that may or may not appear in each lot description, such as title, dimensions, material, folio number and type of illustrations. Through the level of description that varied quite broadly from among sources. So early catalogs, for example, would simply just have the author and title and maybe an indication of its size, like quarto or folio volume, which, as we know, are not really applicable to manuscript description produced on vellum. The descriptive details included in an entry were not meant to be exhaustive or to exactly duplicate the source description, but simply enough to help identify individual books as they moved from one owner to the next. For example, one could track a generically titled book of hours using a few search elements: that it contained 206 folios, measured 146 millimeters in height, and featured 9 miniatures, because there would likely not be another book of hours bearing those same elements. It's also important to note that the descriptive data provided in each entry could only be as accurate and comprehensive as the catalog description itself. We weren't looking at all these manuscripts. It's all coming from catalogs. These match records became an important feature of the database that made Larry's friends in the trade and manuscript studies field to want to start using it as well. A generous spirit, Larry was more than happy to share, and the user community grew. Part of the appeal and usefulness of the database for this user community was its initial focus on auction and sale catalogs as its primary source material, which is an important distinction from Richardson's dependence on collection catalogs. This focus did widen over time to include other sources such as institutional and private collection catalogs, but it's certainly not our strength even now. We still don't have that much representation. Nevertheless, users could eventually search across thousands of sources at a time to locate references to manuscripts as they pass through various collections, auction houses, bookseller shops, and the likes. In 2005, Larry handed his access files, literally handed, them over to the University of Pennsylvania to manage and develop an online presence. The online version of the database provided a robust search interface thanks to the faceted and keyword searching for digging into and through the database to recover references to manuscripts that pass through these sales. So you're seeing the faceted keyword searching over here, and you can sort of drill down your search results depending on what would appear in those facets next to your original search results. The greatest weakness, however, of the old database was its unidirectional relationship with those using it. Researchers could find entries and gather data, but could not contribute the results of their research or their own knowledge back into the database. For instance, a researcher could use the search results to locate where a group of manuscripts went after a sale. But there is no direct way of recording that information to share with other people interested in those same results. That user's knowledge was therefore lost to other unconnected users who could have benefited from these research results to pursue further study. Many times users would email me or Larry with updates, but it was a flawed and inefficient system, and the user community lost a lot of data because of it. Another weakness was the quality of our data, which by 2014 had undergone 3 major platform changes and years of, let's just say, lightly managed metadata standards, resulting from the fact that the database had to adapt to changing needs as it grew, and it became more and more difficult to retroactively compensate for these changes as it grew. Also, humans are not consistent and make mistakes, so from many points of view, our data was imperfect. Without a simple way for users to contribute back their research results obtained from using it, and to submit feedback on the quality of existing data, or to record their own knowledge, coupled with the fact that data entry and management was in the hands of only one full-time staff member, that was me, and sort of a parcel of part-time student workers, it was on a path, the database was on a path to obsolescence. Redeveloping the Schoenberg database to allow open data entry and management to the user community thus became imperative in order to ensure its sustainability. It quickly became apparent that this would be easier said than done. Up until 2014, the back end of the database, where the data entry happens, was still pretty much an enormous flat file spreadsheet, now on Oracle rather than Excel or Access. With minimal use of a few relational tables to help with consistency in names and geographic location. So if you've ever worked with a group managed spreadsheet with other people, you may have a sense of how absurd the thought of managing a globally crowdsourced spreadsheet would be. So our first step in redevelopment was to come up with a new data model that would place enough control on data entry to guide users to contribute or correct data without overly complicating the process and driving them away in frustration. In database design, a data model determines the logical structure of a database and the manner in which data can be stored, organized, and retrieved and manipulated. 2 of the more common database models are the tabular or flat file model and the relational model. The original database, for instance, was flat. That is, it consisted of a single 2-dimensional table of data elements expressed in intersections of columns and rows. A relational database depends on relationships of more than one table or entity related to another by specified common data points in such a way that data can be accessed or reassembled across tables without having to reorganize the database or duplicate data entry. For example, 2 main types of table relationships are a one-to-many, or sometimes called parent-child, or many-to-many relationship. But before we could decide what our new data model would look like, we had to do one very basic thing, which in hindsight turned out to be the most important and difficult and time-consuming work that we undertook in the last 3 years. That was to decide what the database and its data were and what they were not. While you may think it should be fairly obvious or straightforward to answer these questions, it absolutely was not in our experience. And I would venture to say that any data gathering and sharing project, whether it's crowdsourced or not, but especially if it is, that doesn't fully assess and understand its ontological properties and be able to communicate them to others will not succeed, especially when computers are concerned, because computers do not process data as flexibly as humans do. Once we understood what our data structure was, we could then begin tackling many of the risks associated with the questions that I laid out earlier. How do we manage good data entry standards for manuscript description that will continue to make discovery and access possible? Can we accept a certain level of bad data? How do you manage user expectations of what they can and can't do with the data and within the database? So what did we decide the Schoenberg database is, and what does it do? Many may assume, including its creator up to a certain point, that it's a database of manuscripts, hence the name Schoenberg Database of Manuscripts. You may assume that its contents, that is, its records, represent manuscripts. For example, you may think that this entry here represents the manuscript now at Stanford under the shelf mark MS Codex 1126, and you can see that information under the source. But in actuality, it does not represent that manuscript. What it does represent is an observation of that manuscript made by a cataloger for this particular catalog, in this case, the Stanford University Library Online Catalog. In the same way that this record is also an observation of that same manuscript, but at a different time. And here we're looking at an observation from a source, the DeRicci census, made in 1935. And I want to note just quickly here the differences. Here there are three authors. DeRicci gives the date as 13th century. And here the date is slightly more refined, and there's another, an additional author. These two entries illustrate the point that data about manuscripts in the database derives from catalogs or other type of secondary sources, not from the manuscript themselves, a point which Richardson had to contend with as well, if you'll recall. You'll notice that some of the descriptive details are different, and the temptation is to ask, which one represents the true manuscript? Well, from the database's point of view, they both do. They are both true statements reflecting someone else's observation of this particular book. One may appear to be more right than the other, like the more recent one, but as we all know, what one cataloger or scholar thinks is right about a manuscript may be considered incorrect by another cataloger or scholar. Dates, for example, are hard to pin down with medieval manuscripts, so any date determination of an undated manuscript could be subject to unresolvable debate. It is impossible for us to confirm that one observation is more true than the other. So we therefore have to accept that all data that goes into the database has the potential to be true, and therefore every observation must be preserved. Users often approach the Schoenberg database with an expectation that our data reflects some sort of truth about the manuscript itself. I hear this all the time, but it's a mistake. And it's the same mistake Richardson's critics made as well. As we all know, no description is perfect, and there will always be new observations to be made. So how do we manage this expectation? To begin with, we have defined our entries to be observations about manuscripts with an infinite potential for being observed again and again by different sources. We don't make any claims about the objective truth or correctness of an observation supplied in a source. Instead, what we do strive for is the ability to ensure that the database faithfully reflects what its sources record about a manuscript. And when we can't do that, as in the case with our legacy data, we acknowledge in these records with a very obvious flag that the manuscript data, the description data, might not be trustworthy, and that the user bears the responsibility of verifying it by going back to the source if necessary. In this way, we in our user community can accept that some of the data might be bad, and that's okay because the database at least supplies enough information to take the user back to the source for verification. What does this established principle defining our entries mean for the construction of the new data model? First, by accepting that all data originates from a source, we could create a new relational model in which the starting point for all activity, all data entry, is a source. New data entry begins by creating a source record from which all entries relating to that source are linked in a one-to-many relationship. So you can see here, this is the one, and then that's the many. And that many can be as many as you need, as many or as few as you need. This ensures that all source data remains consistent among entries, and that all entries derived from a source are linked together, and finally, that users looking at an entry can link back to the source and its metadata to other associated entries. The new database distinguishes between 5 source types, each with their own metadata, but all of them share a publication date and some sort of identification. 4 of these sources existed in the database prior to redevelopment, though not as separate entities. Auction and dealer catalogs, collection catalogs, online-only auction and bookseller websites like eBay, other published sources, so an article and a journal that reconstructed a historical collection, and other unpublished sources like an inventory and a special collections department. In the new database, we added a 5th type, a personal observation, which I'll speak about more shortly. To give you an idea of what the source record is, this slide shows an example of one for a collection described in Dorici's census. So this is the source for that same entry that I just showed you. Once a source is created, users can then add entries from that source. So here's that entry, and you can see here that the data becomes auto-populated in that entry, and therefore you don't have to keep re-entering this every time, which in a flat file spreadsheet you had to, and it created enormous amounts of problems in terms of duplicate sources floating around. When an entry is created, source details, like I said, are auto-populated in the source field and hyperlinked back to the source record to close the loop. So anything in blue that you see is a link to something else. You'll also notice here that the author names are entered twice. So looking at this, the first in blue is the authority name, which a user must find in our name authority or create if unable to find it among existing name records. The second is the name as it is recorded in the source. This double entry method, which we enforce in all fields involving names, so authors, scribes, artists, provenance agents, allows users making an entry to truthfully represent the source while also expanding discoverability by way of an accepted authority name in our name authority file, which is a third entity in the data model. Here's an example of a name record, just for your purposes. And this number here, the VIAF ID number, is a link. Are you familiar with VIAF? So the VIAF is a virtual international authority file for names. And so the Library of Congress contributes its name authority, the Bibliothèque Nationale in France contributes its name authority, and national libraries across the world contribute their name authorities, and names, so variant names, are provided one number so that you can always link back to that name, always find that name. And it's a very important element in developing linked data for these kinds of projects. You also, just to point out, anything that any user touches is recorded. So Mattia Bodesen last updated this. This is an old name, so we don't have a creator, but you would see who created that name if it were someone who had done it in the new database. The final entity in the data model is what we call a manuscript record. From an entry, users can create or link the entry to a manuscript record through a feature called the linking tool, which I'm not going to take the time to show you now, but can later. Of the 4 entities in this data model, the manuscript record has been the most difficult to pin down conceptually and then convey that concept to new users. Here's a manuscript record. Its sole purpose is to aggregate linked entries referencing the same book in one place and to display associated provenance names supplied by each entry. It also pulls from each entry all associated titles and identifies the entry with the most recent transaction or observation date to indicate the most recently known location. This record, the manuscript record, is problematic. The existence of a record that would represent the thing that each entry referenced was at the top of our users' wish list of features to include in the new database, and users here being our advisory committee that was composed of our power users, we call them, as well as technology experts. So we created the manuscript record in response. It didn't exist before in the old database, except as in the old database, you could see the links to different ID numbers so that you could get to every manuscript that was linked together, but they weren't aggregated in a useful way. However, as it exists now, it's not what our users wanted it to be, because to do what they wanted would have violated our governing principle that the database is not a catalog of manuscripts. So what do I mean by that? Our test users, all humanists, wanted the manuscript record to do two things. First, to be the place where all the link entries could be gathered, which was easy enough to do and logical enough that it could be programmed. But then they also wanted it to be the place where the correct or confirmed data concerning a manuscript, such as current location, author, title, dimensions, etc., would be stored, which our programmers said we absolutely could not do, which drew no small amount of displeasure from the humanists. And we had very long animated discussions about this, especially led by Christoph Flüler of Ecodisease, if anyone knows that project. So why did the programmers nix this idea? It goes back to the principle underlying our data model. Our data, or entries, are subjective observations made about manuscripts in or by a source. If a user attaches data about a manuscript to a manuscript record, then it becomes an observation. But according to our data model, observations must be linked to an identified source. Since manuscript records don't have sources, they can't be entries and therefore can't be considered data as the database defines its data, its entries. From a programmer's point of view, attaching observed data to manuscript records broke the logic of the data model and jeopardized data management and integrity. But our test users were right in that if we didn't have a way for our users to easily contribute their knowledge about a manuscript referenced in a manuscript record that could be more up to date than what was provided in the database, we would again run the risk of losing their information. The solution ended up being fairly straightforward. You simply create a new personal observation that automatically links to the manuscript record, thereby leaving opportunity for the next person who comes along and knows something new or different about that manuscript to add their personal observation to the collection. And so you can see here, for example, we provide links throughout this page. There's another one at the bottom that encourages you to create this new personal observation. By labeling this kind of entry as a personal observation, we make its subjectivity transparent to anyone looking at it. It is then the user's responsibility to decide for themselves which data is the most true or most correct. And the database is now free from that responsibility of being the authority of what is right or wrong, what is true or what is false. The problem of and our solution for the manuscript record issue is one example of how truly understanding the nature and limits of our data help us to manage the user's experience. We've made all other decisions regarding the management of the data along similar lines. For example, we had originally intended for users to edit our legacy data, but it quickly became apparent that this would lead to more problems than it resolved, because then you run the risk of altering the truth of the entry against its source, which is in violation of our rule that the source data is entered as is. So we wanted to remove the temptation of someone saying, oh, that date's not right in Dorici, it's actually 1290, which would, and this is something that Larry Schoenberg actually did in a lot of our records. He would normalize entries when he grouped them together, and it just creates no amounts of problems when you're trying to disentangle reality from unreality. So now no one except the admin level user, so the staff, can change another user's entry. Again, if the data in an entry, source, name, or manuscript record is perceived to be wrong, the user may simply add another personal observation to correct it. Or users can leave comments in these records if the notion of creating a new record doesn't seem appropriate for whatever reason the user decides. Finally, while our purpose is to make the new database available to all levels of users, we do recognize that not all users bring equal skills and knowledge to the database. We therefore have instituted a system of here's an example of a personal observation. And you can see that it's observation date. It's immediately, it's auto-populated as soon as you press the button. Sorry. So there are four user levels that determine what a user can and can't do in the application. Open, contributor, editor, super editor, and admin, which are defined here in this slide. Again, you can see that description for these levels are defined by how each level can interact with the different entities of the data model, with entries, sources, names, and manuscript records. While I've only had time to discuss a few instances of how the data model has impacted our crowdsourcing strategies, I hope to have demonstrated how important it was for us to understand the ontological implications of our data model before we began building the actual database and before we opened those barn doors. While we certainly depend on other forms of user instruction, including directions on every page, tooltips for all fields, instructional videos, we have a FAQ, a frequently asked question, that every user, for those of you who signed on, you have to go through this process that allows us to highlight some of the things that you should expect along the way. None of this would make a difference if the fundamental structure and our management plan was unsound. By accepting and integrating the limitations of our data imposed on us by both history and ontology into our data model, we, I believe, have achieved a level of transparency that will enable users to make informed judgments on how to use and interpret the data. Returning to Richardson's failed Union World Catalog by way of conclusion, I want to reiterate that the biggest obstacle he faced was his necessary reliance on human input and participation. One of the great advantages of the database is that we can manipulate our users' interaction with the database and integrate controls to guide data entry that's, quote, good enough. We can also minimize the effect of the tension between manuscript description, that is a virtuosic display of scholarship, like one of these full catalog records that goes on and on and on, or a description that simply does the job of making it possible to identify a manuscript, such as Richardson's very one-line level of description, by being upfront about the limitations of our data in the application itself. Finally, we have the luxury of knowing that even if our user community doesn't participate or loses interest, the database will continue to exist and we will continue to add data because Penn has committed to it. In the next 2 years, we will also be exploring the promise of linked open data to expand our data sources and build networks among other related resources, which has another layer of access and community involvement, and I hope in 2 years' time to be able to explain what that is going to look like. So for now, we have a level of flexibility and a critical mass of data that Richardson could never achieve. But as I convey this to you, my thoughts necessarily turn back to Richardson and how similar the idealistic rhetoric surrounding the formulation of projects like mine and Richardson's are. Think, for example, of the frequency with which linked open data is thrown around as the answer to any number of research and discovery problems these days, and yet there's so few results in linked data. Like Richardson's project, our success depends upon a level of altruistic behavior on the part of our community of users, our crowd, that may not actually exist. But if we can convince our user community that contributing to the database is truly to their own benefit, we have a good chance of success. And if we can capture it at the same time that they're doing their research. But even if we don't, the database will still continue to exist and be a useful resource for the provenance of manuscript books. I don't really have to worry about it in the way that Richardson did. This is what really sets it apart from Richardson's project, which, due to the limits of storage technologies as they existed at this time, namely paper card files and print publication, made it unsustainable after he quit working on it. Clearly, there continues to be a demand for such universal catalogs and manuscripts, so we will continue to persist in our efforts. I hope to, at least with the new Schoenberg database, keep pushing the needle of success forward of what Richardson started nearly 100 years ago. Thank you very much. I also wanted to mention I brought in, this is the material evidence, or 2 volumes of it, of Richardson's project, if you're interested in looking at it.
I just want to commend you on striking a wonderful balance between a completely open door and having upper levels of administrators who are sometimes just going to have to change things. We recently tried to set up a online sort of family tree of hand paper making experts in the world community, and when you try to create a family tree, if you have an editor or an editorial board, you're going to run into problems right away because people haven't been included or you've got my record wrong. Finally, we decided we're going to have a completely open door. You want to be part of this? Make your own entry, add anything you want. It still turns into a useful data set because you can use all of the entries to link people together and no one feels excluded. So I think what you've got set up here is really beautiful, and it seems to me like it could be a model for other databases. So good luck.
Thank you. I hope it works.
I want to thank you for that lucid introduction of the history of how you got where you got, because I had looked occasionally online and been puzzled that this didn't match what I thought a catalog was. So it's very useful to know that. I've just accidentally encountered an issue that I wonder if you've got a correction for, which is that as you were talking about how it worked, I tried looking up an author that a 14th century author whom I helped rediscover. And I mean, other people had worked on him, but nobody in 50 years by the time I got to him. So his last name is Aureolus. And when I did a search for him, I intermingled with him are texts. He was a theologian. These are medical texts that have the title Aureola, which of course is a impossibility in Latin that it comes from Aureolus, right? So if you got a way in which mechanically linguistic oddities can be signaled so that an editor would look in and realize that a title and an author's name are not connected, and so get the false entries out of the search results. Did I make myself more or less clear? So aureola is feminine, can't come from a name that's masculine.
I'm going to see if I can find what you're talking about. Hello? Oh, there it goes. Okay.
A-U-R-E-O-L-I. Actually, what I really first typed in was A-U-R-E-O-L.
I do sort of understand what you're talking about, but I need to see the entries.
Yeah.
It's moving a bit slowly.
And I just realized that putting in the most commonly used English version of his name is what gave me the false results. Because something in the algorithm is giving any possible ending beyond A-U-R-E-O-L, right?
Yes. While it's loading.
Try it again. Can you see that it's loading somewhere?
Yeah, the circle's going.
Yeah, it's like on page 2 or 3 of the results. Let's see if I can get it once you do that.
So let me try this. So Areola was in a title, was provided as a title?
It's the title of a medical text.
Right.
And
And you want to distinguish it from,
from the author I'm looking for.
Okay.
Because,
well, of course, the database seems to be down.
well, it's
Which
actually.
it was not this morning.
Huh.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I did screenshots in my presentation.
That's why mine is still.
So okay, let me get to the.
My
So
point.
if you did search results for AUREOL, you're going to get, let's say, 200 results. If you want to go down, this is where you need to use the faceted searching to drill down.
Okay.
So again, this display isn't ideal, but we're sort of stuck with it. So where's author? All right, so author is up here. So you could now you're in a facet that returns results.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I haven't done the search, but if I had done the search, you would have the results, and then you would go to the facet and return the results containing those characters in the different facets, and you can go to the author and see if you can find the one that you're looking for.
Yeah. My point is a slightly different one. Since I'm an
Yeah.
expert on them, I know that this is a false result, right? But you're putting in manuscripts that are in different languages. So what's the solution as a theoretical problem to having an algorithm that can tell which linguistic combinations make no sense in a language and so must not be connected?
Well, we can't,
Okay.
right?
But lots of online catalogs have solved the problem. So
Right.
I don't know anything about the architecture behind them.
But this isn't a catalog. So what you would have to do, and this is why we're reaching out to our users, right? You're doing research in our database, and you come up with these results, and you need to separate them out. You start separating them out, you find that a lot of them are, legacy data. So those are prone to error. But you see that you find those by the author that you want, and then you can. This is complicated, and so I hope it makes some sense. But when you're in those records, or you're writing your own personal observations that you can then link to existing records, you can give the name of you can create the authority name that you want to create for that record, which hopefully already has an existing entry. So my point is that we're asking you to fix these problems. We're asking the user community to fix these problems because we can't go back through and identify everything that's sort of odd about the database. We also can't say that, well, if this name was entered incorrectly or this title was entered incorrectly, that it was wrong or right. But it's what the source gives. And so,
But it can't be that. It must be an algorithm because it won't return to me something that says AUREOLP because that doesn't occur,
yeah.
right? But it is giving me AUREOLP.
It is an algorithm.
Which is a totally unrelated word.
Because you're only typing in AUREOL.
Yeah, but even
So it's
with that,
searching.
actually, it doesn't give me a P after that. So it has some rules for language
But-
possibilities.
But it wouldn't you wouldn't find it because there's no P. And if there were a set of characters that had ended with P, it would return that result. You're not satisfied with that?
I'm thinking.
It's also, there are some issues with the search capability, but
I'm just thinking this is a bigger problem. It's not a particular author, and it's not. If you have a non-expert, they won't see that you're getting a linguistic impossibility for the language they're using.
and hopefully what will happen is that non-expert will post a question on the forum and get other. This is how we're trying to manage this because we can't come up with the answers ourselves, and so people, writing to us by email are expecting answers, and we don't have the expertise because we've just collected data. So this is an example of how we say we are not something. We are not experts in this. Please help us refine our data. So if a user community develops around this question, then we can come to some kind of resolution. Exactly. It's a disconnect, right? It's not something that, it took me a long time to get to this point as a manuscript cataloger.
Thank you, Lynn. That was just fascinating. I've got a question about mischievous users.
Mm-hmm.
Is this actually on right now? Good. Okay. And I also have an ontological question about what a manuscript is. The mischievous question, I'm wondering just playfully, whether someone having created a forgery could use your database as a way of authenticating the existence of something that doesn't exist because of the open source, of the fact that you can expert crowdsource. This just has to do with these correction mechanisms that have to come from the community and not from the editors, because it goes beyond the editor's capacity. Again, that's just kind of a fun, playful thing. I was also wondering about the question of what constitutes a manuscript, because that's not something you mentioned. It's clearly not predefined. It doesn't exist in the world. Nothing carries a label. It's an entirely one of our own attributes to say that this is a manuscript and this is not. It's kind of a Wittgensteinian issue. So clearly the world of manuscripts has edges, and they begin to fade off, and we say very clearly that a stela is not a manuscript because it has different properties. So where does the edges of what constitutes an eligible manuscript reside? At what level is that determination made, and how would you remove or even do anything to entries that begin to fall off the landscape into the valley that doesn't constitute a manuscript?
So those two questions I can sort of answer them together. So we have a user management system, and admins, our job will be not data entry in the future, but monitoring data entry, right? So we can see everything that everybody's doing, and if something looks suspicious, we can flag it and flag that user and boot them out. The next question, so when Larry started the database, he was only including manuscripts of 5 folios or more that were produced before 1600, because his interests were originally, in 1997, European. But this is a problem when you try to start including Arabic manuscripts or Japan or China or any number of other locations that we're starting to bring into the database, where the concept of a book, which is what we're trying to document, as opposed to a document, like a charter or something. We're not doing charters, and this is also a decision that Richardson had made.
So it has to have a certain number of folios or gatherings.
Well, sort of, right? That's how we've traditionally made decisions, but this is something that we're going to open to our user community, because there are books, conceptual books that are less than 5 folios, and you don't want to discard those. We don't want to not include a Quran that was produced in 1601. So we're saying, okay, user community, if you feel this is important, then we're going to change our standards with the knowledge that you're going to be missing a lot of data. So we're going to rely really heavily on how our users interact with this. And in a lot of ways, we're just foisting all the responsibility of management onto our user community. I don't know if this will work, but that's the idea, because all we can do realistically is manage data at this point. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
It's pretty interesting. In other words, I was wondering whether it was the community that helped define the edges of what the community was going to decide as a manuscript.
Yeah, I hope it is.
Yeah.
I hope it is. I hope there's enough interest to do that.
Hi, I'm Colleen Tyson from Special
Colleen.
Collections here. And I just, as a follow-up to that, is there any hope for leaves in the future, or is that just completely unmanageable?
It's kind of unmanageable.
I
And this is where we're going to we're hoping that our linked data project will help us, because with, I don't know if you know about fragment projects that Lisa Fagan-Davis and Deborah Cashin are working on something called, or working with a tool called Broken Books, where Lisa is gathering all the leads of the Beauvais missile, which was cut up and dispersed by Otto Egge. So she's gathering images, wherever she can find them, and trying to piece together this book. Christoph Flüler and the eCodices project now has an offshoot called Fragmentarium, where they're trying to do something similar. So my hope is that they do them, right?
Yeah.
They collect their fragments and they say, okay, this is a book. They assign some kind of value to that book that we can then put into the database and then link out to their fragment project. But fragments are just, it's just too hard.
Yeah,
it's just too hard.
So that
Especially
other one
for-
was called Fragmentarium?
Fragmentarium.
Okay, thanks.
And it's in the beginning stages, so they're working on developing. I don't know if you can get to anything yet, but maybe.
Former PhD student was in charge of that.
Sure, yeah, well,
Yeah.
all of the Egge revelations,
Yes.
yeah, it's just another interesting
Yeah.
piece to the
Yeah.
puzzle. Yeah, great, thank you.
And we're hoping that, like, the databases, the Digging into Data grant was, I didn't mention that. Did anyone mention? We just received a Digging into Data challenge grant with other institutions, the Bodleian Library at Oxford and their e-research center, and the ERHT's Biblissima project, and then the Semantic Web Computing group in Aalto University in Finland, to create a linked data environment. So what we're hoping is projects like the database and projects like Fragmentarium will be able to feed off of each other in this environment. So that's my answer. That's my cop-out. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm just kind of curious about how you manage the standardization of that. I believe you said earlier that when you're putting in the actual author, you have a set of names you can choose from.
Mm-hmm.
How do you choose what your standard name is? Because I don't think you could just do it in their modern language, because I mean, some of them it's literally in Arabic letters, and you just would not be able to make that in English at their modern form.
Yeah. We're having, I guess in the seminar this afternoon, I was going to demonstrate that a little bit. I can do it now. Or if you'd rather wait when we're working in a record. But basically what happens is, I'm afraid to try it since it seems not to be. Yeah, it's slow for some reason, but, oh no, there it goes, okay. Okay, I'm doing something that no one else can do because I'm admin. So you type in the as recorded name. So, and then you're supposed to, we don't require anything. We really try to keep this as easy as possible, but you're supposed to look for Joe Smith in our name authority record. So let's say it wasn't Joe Smith, and let's say, well, there are Smiths. I won't do the search for Boethius, but you can see that like these are all the unique values, and our name authority is developing, right? And this is something that we also want to crowdsource. And you can decide which one of these, select it and pop that name. If you don't see your name, then you can propose Joe Smith. You can, now it says Boethius because I typed that in. You can find suggestions in VIAF. So now by clicking this button, what I'm doing is going out to the VIAF online name authority file and looking to see if he appears there. And so we've pulled it in. These are the possibilities. If you don't see them, you can, you just leave it blank, or if you see a name that looks to be the same, you pop it in and the VIAF number appears here. Or you can also just directly link out to VIAF if you feel like it should be in there and it's not. So that's how we do the name authorities. There's a lot of work involved. There's a lot of cleanup involved. And if you have any interest in name authorities, and there are a lot of people that really like this kind of stuff, including myself, I would love to talk to you because it's something that we definitely will need to crowdsource. Does that answer your question?
It does. I was just kind of with that kind of curious about then when you're actually doing a search on there, will it only match me when I'm looking for authors with that authority name, or will it match the parentheses suggesting they actually recorded?
Both. So when you're doing a general search, a keyword search, it's looking for any similar strings of characters, whether it's in the as recorded or the name authority. So that's how we've opened up and try to solve as simply as possible without weighting down the data model too much, this problem of variation in authority name. So.
Thanks. Thank you, Lynn. It's exciting to see the project really progressing quickly. Quick question about so you point to the Union catalog as sort of a precursor, and I guess it's a shared universality in scope or eventual goal. But it seems like there's a difference because your catalog is at least initially focused more on the book market and the record of exchanges and provenance, so that's adding a valuable layer that wasn't going to be in the Union catalog, but the Union catalog seemed more focused on actually combining earlier catalog descriptions or pulling from them. Is there a similar goal with the Schoenberg database of going to the standard collections of dated manuscripts and condensing? Okay, so
what we want to do, everything in the database up to now, except for the Houghton Library records, is manually entered. The Houghton, in 2009, at the same time we moved to the online platform, we ingested the Houghton MARC records and then spent just the same amount of time trying to clean them up and get them to fit into our data model that we could have just put it in by hand. But the next one of the sort of final pieces of the grant is working on a metadata mapping tool, so that if there is an electronic catalog, a digital catalog, we can take their data.
Great.
And again, this is also something that we hope the linked data issue will resolve.
Yes. Great, thank you.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I didn't have time to go into this, but there are a lot of assumptions in Richardson's method, right? That people are interested in the text, not the book itself. So his emphasis on author and title, that's what he wants to get, right? He's not really interested in other details. And I think another assumption that he's making is that these collections were static. So that if you described all the manuscripts that were in this library in Tortuga, so that 100 years from now, those manuscripts would still be there. So he doesn't account for that instability in collections, which I think he could have worked out, because you would just take the card out and replace it with a new card. But I'm not sure how he would have tracked that progress. And he wasn't interested in provenance history. The database it's what people use it for, is for provenance history, not textual scholarship.
Yeah.
So those are two other differences, but there's still, the similarities. Sometimes I feel like I was reading the summary of method before coming here, and I just, everything that Richardson was talking about, we've had those same discussions over the last 3 years. It was really a bit eerie. So I feel like I've been possessed by a librarian.
On that note, please join me in thanking
Thank you.